going up. Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, a podcast that explores Bowen family systems theory concepts and ideas in brief and clear ways, starting with an elevator pitch. Today, Amie Post is back on the elevator with us to discuss nuclear family emotional system. And Katie White is here as well. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah. And I will give a little bio for you, Amie, if that's all right. Amie lives in Baltimore, Maryland, and is a marriage and family therapist. She is executive director of the Center for Family Systems Theory of Western New York, and previously was the executive director at the Family Crisis Center of Baltimore County. She's been studying Bowen theory, I thought I would say, since the turn of the century. Is that okay? Since 2001, and is a member of the faculty and on the board of directors at the Bowen Center in Washington. She's also a wife, mom, and grandmother. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. Amie, welcome.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be back here with you and thinking alongside you.
Yeah. Well, do you want to begin with your elevator pitch on the Bowen theory concept of the nuclear family emotional system?
Yeah, I appreciated actually in our correspondence ahead of time, Dixie, you punched up that Dr. Bowen uses that term emotional system quite intentionally, and that oftentimes we morph it into being inclusive of both the system and the processes. So I thought about my elevator pitch being two levels. One, the nuclear family emotional system is the way Dr. Bowen conceptualizes the family organizing itself as a level unit upon which evolutionary pressures are acting. And then the nuclear family emotional processes are the automatic patterns and mechanisms that the family has available to it as it navigates the challenges of day-to-day life. Those two concepts or ideas within the bigger concept can't be separated from each other. There's both a system and the way the system responds.
Excellent. Katie, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I had some similar ideas. So I wrote, it's always fun to try and capture all these things quickly. The predictable automatic ways that the family system responds to a rise in, here's my debate, tension, stress, or anxiety. All those words have been used. These include conflict, distance, over and under functioning, and projection onto a child. And these are the responses of the system to this increased stress, not the individual. The system is having memory, and I wrote intelligence to determine how to manage a challenge. So I talked about, how do I observe when I get uncomfortable? How do I observe when my system gets uncomfortable? Sometimes I don't notice the discomfort. I just notice the behavior. And then how do I see this as an adaptive mechanism that has kept my family and the human species moving forward?
Good. Well, I'll do mine, and then I'll do Dr. Bowen's, and then we'll jump in to discussion. So my pitch was nuclear family emotional system concept describes the actions or behaviors that humans use to manage tension and anxiety in relationship. Dr. Bowen observed 4 basic patterns in families, which Katie just mentioned. The intensity and use of these patterns shift based on maturity and level of anxiety, but even when life is fairly low stress, these 4 patterns are operating in the background like a computer or an engine that keeps things running with only 4 basic kind of moves or ways of operating. And then Dr. Bowen, man, it was hard to choose here. I've got 3 pitches, but they each sort of say different things or highlight different things. This concept describes the pattern of emotional forces, or in another place, he used the range of relationship patterns as they operate over the years in the nuclear family. Over time, the emotional problem becomes manifest as A, emotional distance between spouses, B, dysfunction in one spouse, which is manifested as physical, emotional, or social illness, C, marital conflict, or D, projection of the problem to one or more children. Another place, he says, there is a range of adaptive patterns available in the nuclear family. In periods of calm, the adaptive patterns can function without symptoms arising in any family. As anxiety and tension increase, the adaptive patterns lose flexibility and symptoms erupt. He goes on, the family does not have conscious choice about the selection of adaptive patterns. These were, quote, programmed into the spouses in their parental families. In general, there is more adaptability in families with a spectrum of patterns than a family with fewer patterns. And then I have one more, but it's sort of shifting us. So I will stop talking. That was rapid fire elevator pitches. What do you two notice?
I'm just struck by, again, I think it's a good reminder that Dr. Bowen's ideas are grounded in this notion that the emotional system is the part that humans have in common with all other forms of life. And it lives in each individual and in each level of systems organization instinctually. It's showing up automatically. And it is part of a series of techniques the organism has retained to survive and thrive. This is not the same as how do people feel and then how do they respond to their feeling. This is how people are sensing and reacting to the basic tension to be for self and relate to other, to survive, procreate, and kind of persist into generations to come. So it's much deeper than just how do you feel and then how are you responding to those feelings.
Yeah, that's what I was picking up on, also this idea of, all of us use sort of different words, and Bowen used some words to talk about this programming, this automatic, I said an intelligence of the species, that there's something underneath that kind of knows how to approach this. And I appreciate that in Bowen's idea of the system having some intelligence around how they approach challenge.
Katie, what you're saying, though, it kind of reminds me, Bowen writes, and then Kerr picks up in Family Evaluation that the basic challenge is navigating those life forces. How do we connect to each other? And yet, how do we also stay separate from? How do we have these automatic ways of responding to life? And also, how do we leverage a broader way of thinking that allows us to kind of slow down the automatic and think more broadly? And all of that interplay is showing up in the way the patterns get organized and show up with intensity.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback on that because I took a quote. I was gonna take us a little potentially controversial from Bowen's video that he talks about a fixed amount of immaturity in a family that needs to be handled in these ways. And I think it gets at the idea of the scale of differentiation, how some families will be able to manage. I mean, I guess that's what I'm questioning here, is how I'm thinking about it is sort of there's sort of this max amount of stress and tension a system can manage that varies along that spectrum. So some people, I gave an example, I think, in my writing here, but, sometimes something can happen, like someone can lose a job and it really collapses a system's response, whereas another system might be able to manage that level of stress or tension differently. So I think I was also thinking about how he kind of postulates this idea that there is this fixed amount. He uses immaturity, which I can get reactive to, or so I'm like stress or tension, that the system can manage before kind of it kicks into these mechanisms. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I was thinking about it.
Yeah, I did a little bit of digging for myself, like where does this start? Which is a complicated question because Bowen talks about the nuclear family emotional system beginning in courtship and kind of getting consolidated as two partners form a union. And that union is, Bowen uses that word fusion. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that the triangles with one's parents and the degree to which you have been able to separate from and remain connected to them is fundamentally organizing how you move toward a partner. That partnership, the degree to which you're overlapping with another and dependent upon them to be a solid and whole self, that has that whole range you're talking about. And I was thinking about the less overlap, the more flexibility you might have. And in some cases, the more overlap, perhaps the greater advantage you have to getting through a tight spot. So there might be benefits to the whole continuum.
Is there an example that one of you could think of that might illustrate what you're speaking to?
I am jazzed up on football this time of year. And I was thinking about the difference between a JV football team that has one or two really, really strong players with one or two go-to plays. And they do pretty well as long as the conditions are at or below their basic capacity. But if they're relying on one or two basic plays and one or two players to do the whole thing, when they start to get increasingly challenged in their competition, they don't have as much flexibility. And then contrast that with a pro team that just has every single player has a broad range of capacity, and every single player has some flexibility to play different roles. And they go from having two plays available to them to hundreds of thousands with versions of every play possible. Lamar Jackson is such a dang threat because you never know if he's going to run the ball or pass the ball. And if he runs it, he might do a side pass. He is just dogging the defense because he is so flexible. But his flexibility only shows up because he's working with all the other players who are equally as flexible. I think that's an example of what a nuclear family emotional system can look like at lower and higher levels.
I was going to take it in a very wildly different direction, which was we just are recording this after the holidays, and so over the holidays I spent time either watching stuff or reading. So my first watching example was I watched a lot of Harry Potter. Daughter is continually obsessed with Harry Potter, and I just got so interested in thinking about the shift in that unit. I haven't been to a boarding school, but I think they function probably somewhat like a system and a family. And the shift in that unit when Harry really recognizes, because Hermione tells him, that each person brings value to that system. So I was just thinking about kind of the predictable way that they respond. I think that movie tells me about kind of the predictable way the system responds. And then almost thinking about it developmentally, where, everyone moves from thinking Harry, this one person in the unit, is going to save the whole world, to really being able to function more flexibly as a system. So I don't know if that's getting at the same level of like different levels of differentiation, but that movie had me thinking about that, about how when the system can look at the resources it has available to it and how to best use those resources, I think it does a little better. And I don't know if there was thinking behind that, or really that movie kind of demonstrates kind of the automatic that people step forward and take roles. It made me think of family. So that was my example.
The television show The Bear, that is very, very popular. I don't know if you guys have watched it. I have given it a college try, and I realized I cannot watch it. A few weeks ago, I got into the start of season 2, and I'm like, okay, I've had a good day. I'm in a good headspace, but the amount of fighting and conflict in that show, just like it's just unmanageable. Which, I mean, I think I've said before in other episodes that makes a lot of sense to me, from what I know, in my sort of family and world. But it's a great show to think through. I mean, lots of conflict is used. What are the mechanisms that are used? And can you pay attention to who gets the blame, or who's on whose side, who stays out or runs away from things, and who are the people that get extra responsible or under responsible. And like I said, I haven't seen it to see how they sort of rise and fall, but Katie, what you're speaking of is, as the tension increases, how do these patterns get magnified?
And I do like that show. So I also think about the ways that they pull, Amie kind of caught at this idea of how some of these mechanisms can pull systems together to function more effectively. And, watching that show, it's so interesting how the conflict in some ways does pull them together to get a challenge accomplished. Yeah, I've thought a lot about that show. I think that has a lot of good examples of how families function.
And you see the family, like there is a family in there, right?
I think what you're picking up here, both the Harry Potter series and the Bear represent that way. Dr. Bowen wrote that families who have a mix of these mechanisms available to them, distance, conflict, the symptom in a partner or dysfunction in a partner, he uses those words. He also talks about this dominant adaptive reciprocity or projection onto a kid. In the Bear, what's interesting to watch in the arc of the story is when certain individuals who carried a symptom are no longer available in the family unit, and that functional mechanism to manage is not available, something else emerges with as much intensity. And I think in Harry Potter, one of the cool things to watch in that arc is they do kind of go heavy at conflict early on. Then they do a lot of distance. Then they learn to kind of do some reciprocal functioning. At different times, different main characters end up with a symptom which pops up the functioning of others. And they finally kind of unify their moving forward force when they have a projection or a focus on the outside person. So they can unite behind that. I just think it's cool because what both of those movies or shows are lifting up is that there is a range, and the mix of these mechanisms helps contribute to the adaptation. The mechanisms themselves, the particular processes, are not problematic. It's the degree to which they're operating out of awareness with intensity and maybe devoid of contextual application.
Well, last season we have episodes about each of these patterns and mechanisms, and there was lots of nature examples. There was it the locusts? Was that the one with Kathleen Smith?
Kathleen Smith and the locusts who bite each other's bums.
And I know in one of our classes we were talking about I forget if it was gorillas or some sort of species like that, with like the triangling of the sort of a dominant mother. And so, yeah, just knowing that this is not just humans, right? That these patterns serve a purpose in all sorts of life.
Yeah.
Quanta magazine last week published a recent article that is in a lab space. They have been able to replicate endosymbiosis, which is the fusion of two separate entities to form a new type of life. And the challenge before was that the automatic that lives in cells is to protect against invasion from another. So that basic conflicting, and then the basic distancing, stay away from potential obliteration or loss of your own being, to movement in evolution where a new form of life emerges out of the fusion. And it's because of that fusion, each entity has a new capacity to adapt, survive, and thrive. So I think for me, that's just useful to remind myself that fusion isn't necessarily a bad thing. The degree to which it is totally losing myself in a human relationship phenomenon might be an opportunity to study and think about.
Super interested about that idea of what does it take for a system to be open to doing something different, I suppose, is what to produce something new, the system has to be available to do something different. I mean, change. That's interesting. I think about the many people I sit with in therapy, like change is hard. Being different is on a consistent basis for a consistent period of time is really challenging. So what does it take for a system to be open to that? Interesting.
Yeah.
That was one thing I really appreciated about Dr. Bowen's writing regarding the nuclear family emotional system, is that it's the patterns that have been living in the family for generations that either get replicated or refuted in the next generation. So sometimes we might say, you don't really understand this stuff. You Bowen people, you don't get it. I am so different than my family of origin. We're doing everything so differently. And I think that always lifts up for me the question of, is the difference something that is responsive, or is the difference something that is reactive? And the degree to which those mechanisms are being kind of intentionally and carefully cultivated might be a hint at what level of fusion is driving the effort.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so clear, what's been happening for eons will continue to happen unless it gets, as Katie's suggesting, observed and then kind of confronted, maybe.
And how do you know the difference between I'm being thoughtful about this or reactive?
And I was speaking to someone about this idea the other day, and in the debate with this person, we were talking about, can you even catch that in a generation? I mean, can you catch that difference between reactive, thoughtful response in one generation, or does it take kind of watching what that third generation pops out to see, I guess, outcome? I guess if I'm thinking outcome data, how do you watch the ability of a system to change? I mean, I think I'd be interested in thinking about how medical folks do that. My mom was told by her doctor, that her parents both had heart disease, and she has no markers of that. And the doctor said to her, in one generation, you were able to sort of reverse a genetic predisposition. Now, that's just one off, she told me through reporting, but that's a doctor thinking about what goes into shifting a system, a genetic system, and does our generation mess it up again? Do we flip it back?
When, how do you think about the nuclear family emotional system just being one of many systems that are operating all the time? And I was thinking, if it's an emotional system, the minute you begin to observe it by employing the intellectual system, are you necessarily shifting it? And I think that's where the concept, the theory and the concepts become so incredibly powerful, because they're viewfinders at some level. You get to begin to see, how is this happening over time? At the holiday dinner table, how many heartbeats does it take before somebody pushes back and says, I need to go start the fire in the living room? Or somebody else starts to nitpick over what side of the plate the napkins are going to get folded toward. Or somebody else sits with somebody and says, gosh, that person is so nitpicky on the napkins. How quickly does somebody drink a bottle of wine when somebody else who's always been the bottle of wine drinker, when does that get picked up and shifted?
Yeah, I always think just, how do you watch that in a system? That had me thinking of those two things, just watch the kind of system try and do something differently, and where does it shift? It also made me think of something you said, that my psychology professor in my undergraduate, that had us all journal something, track something, because of the observation you just made. By nature of tracking something, you're already doing something different about the behavior.
Yeah, my takeaway was, observing the pattern is a different experience than reflexively doing it. And for me, that's what I found useful in this concept, is that I go pretty fast to shame and judgment of, well, lots of people, but also myself. And recognizing that this is just what people do. This is what I do. And yeah, just noticing that versus, oh my goodness, here I go again. And then the frustration leads me to get even more sort of stuck. That's what's been one of the helpful things.
Here, my takeaway, I was remembering how I learned to play basketball as a little kid, and I was told there are 3 things you can do when you get the ball. You can dribble, you can shoot, or you can pass. And I remember learning many years later that there was actually a fourth thing I could do, which is take a deep breath and see what's going on the court before I reacted with one of those commands. I think the tools of being able to see conflict, distance, this over-under reciprocity or projection onto a child as a basic set of patterns or rules for play, and introducing the notion that I have some choice in what I do when, if I can work on regulating myself in response to the relationship process going on. That to me is the takeaway that provides a little bit of hope as I look forward to this new year.
Okay, my takeaway went a little bit different direction because I think I said before when we were talking that I read this book over the holidays as well. But my takeaway was thinking about how you see this in a system. And, one of the things I think that was brilliant that I don't think has been replicated that Bowen did was he had multiple families kind of sit together in family therapy and didn't have them interact with each other, but just had one family be the family kind of on the hot seat while other people listen. I watch this in supervision all the time of how I can learn things about my own system by listening to other people's experiences, by listening to kind of questions someone's asking them or just ways that they're thinking about their system. So one of my takeaways was this idea of where else I get really bogged down in looking and seeing these things in my own system. It's really a challenge for me. So sometimes I find I have the best insight by kind of seeing it through something else. So I read this book, The Most Fun We Ever Had by Claire Lombardo. And I thought it was a good, if people want to take about looking at a family system and thinking about these ideas, the thing about this book is it watches this family from the course of when the couple forms through to when they're having grandchildren at the end. And so it watches this story of this family who they're a white middle class family from Chicago that, they are up against some challenges that some might have and others might not. But just to watch how each of these mechanisms shows up for this family, from fusion of the couple formation to as they have each child, the projections that they make on each of their 4 children, there's some symptoms that pop up throughout the process. And just to be able to listen to this other family's experience, thinking about these ideas, and then do you get curious, what's the projection in my family? How does that show up? I just think that's the way I learn. So I'm popping that in the mix to see if that's useful. It doesn't have to be that book. We also talked about some movies. I watched part of the Golden Globes last night about all the movies that are coming out there about stories of families and systems. I think part of the privilege of being a therapist is you get to sit and listen to a lot of families' stories and experiences. And I learn a lot about my own system through that experience. So it was my long-winded takeaway and book plug.
I was thinking, Katie, too, Dr. Bowen's kind of encouragement and admonishment, maybe a challenge, invitation to pick up looking for these mechanisms across other species. And Victoria Harrison's, I think she's done a nice job of within our phylogenetic lineage is important as well. And just asking, are these really part of all life? And if they are, how does that knowledge help us get a little more objective about the miserable ways we take on our challenges?
And I think the nice thing, I challenge people to just, there's a lot of disciplines out there. I wrote this in my notes too. People are really in other disciplines beginning to see how have been seeing how interconnected species are. So, look at anthropology or biology or what else did brain study, the body study, like these different ways that systems are interconnected and get interested in them.
Mm-hmm. The one thing that I said I wanted to ask, and we have time, so I'm going to ask it, is that initially I had put out, we're going to call this episode Nuclear Family Emotional Process. And Amie, you alluded to this in your definition. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but other phrases that get used about this are emotional process, relationship process. And for me, after, I don't know, I've only been doing this formally for a handful of years here, but that relationship process something doesn't click with me in that phrase. And so I don't know if either of you have a well, can you do an elevator pitch on that? Is it the same kind of thing? Is it these patterns? How is it different than nuclear family emotional system? Or maybe we just go back to what you initially said, Amie. But
I don't use relationship process, so I don't have a way of thinking about it. What I did find that was useful is Bowen on page 203 in Family Therapy and Clinical Practice. He actually kind of acknowledges his own shifting. And he talks about this is my interpretation, migrating from the concept of undifferentiated ego mass. And then I thought he provides a rationale for that is really about scaling the family as an emotional unit that could nest and be a part of other emotional systems that form, bigger and smaller. And I think that really ties nicely to multi-level selection and evolutionary theory, that the pressures to adapt, survive, and thrive are happening at multiple levels all the time and in a dynamic interdependence. I think these relationship processes we talk about is like the jargon shorthand for really trying to talk about conflict, distance. And we sometimes get really focused on what behavior is showing up, but we miss the opportunity to explore how is that behavior being motivated in the relationship fusions and by the level of differentiation available to the organism.
I mean, there is a question to think through that. I'm going to chew on that one for a month or so, that one you just asked. Because I think, you're talking about the idea, I think, of how do we keep widening that lens? How do we keep not getting focused on one little thing? And I do think that is one of the gifts of Bowen theory, is to be able to move out from just narrowing into, I see couples come in and want to think about this all the time. I just want to talk about the conflict we're having. We need to get better communication. And I could do that. I could do that as a therapist. I could teach them different communication skills. I could talk, sit in a session and talk out their problems. But to me, I always think, is that just kind of putting a Band-Aid on it, when I'm not looking at the whole system, that maybe this conflict that this couple is having, although uncomfortable, can be adaptive to something in the system, or just even for them to think and look at it that way would be interesting for their brains.
Bowen was really clear. When it is primarily conflict and intensely organized and oriented toward the partner without any spillover worry toward the children do okay. It's actually maybe even protective of the kids if it's just at some levels of maturity. If you're going to be intense, you might as well go as far as you can with conflict. That is better for the kids. That's how I read it, than if you are conflictual, intense, and also focusing down on the kids with that.
There's a study.
Well, and I guess my sort of takeaway from this discussion is that it's like a mix of noticing myself in my context, my patterns, and thinking through the system. And what do I observe there, right? Because I'm the only person that I can do anything about, right? I can work on managing myself, but not just getting caught up in one little narrow focus, but seeing it with a broader perspective.
Yeah. And how would you also kind of broaden the definition of self beyond the individual to thinking about the family as a self that has these kind of basic ways of sensing and responding to the world and itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In Bowen's Chalk Talk, he draws a couple, so a husband and a wife, and draws their family unit above, and then I don't know if he does it with his arm, but it plunks down, like the wife will bring what she's brought from this nuclear family, she's going to bring it into that marriage, and the husband is going to do the same, and then what forms from these different
And even thinking about my couple that's sitting in front of me, what a curious question to throw at their brains, that one you just asked right there. Well, what do you watch that shows up in your family here that you took from the unit you grew up in? I mean, I think I always get really interested in what people think about when I throw that question their way.
Reactively or thoughtfully. Yeah. Good. Well, anyone else want to add anything?
I think I'm good. I could take it in different directions, but I'm watching our time, so I'm not going to.
Yes, much more to say. Well, thanks so much for joining us again, Amie.
It's my pleasure.
Great. Yeah, it was great to have you here. And thanks to everyone for listening. I hope that you've taken away some ideas to think about and observe as you go out. Oh, Katie?
I'm going to say I was going to put in a plug, and I would like to put in a plug because Amie will be joining us in Vancouver for our hybrid conference in September 2025. So,
right.
Oh, October 2025.
October.
I will have Dixie correctly put the date because my brain just went a little early January there. But it would be great for you to join us in Vancouver in October.
Yes, thanks for that reminder, Katie. I will put up the link, and I hope that this episode has been useful as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.